If even one guard moves, it will dishonor the Pope himself. That's what Commandant Schmid warned before the funeral began. But as the coffin of Pope Francis emerged into St. Peter's Square, one guard did move, stepping forward with something no one expected and leaving the entire Vatican stunned. So, what was hidden beneath his uniform? Before we reveal it, press the subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The polished black boots of Lance Corporal Lucas Bowman remained perfectly still against the ancient stones of St. Peter's Square. His Swiss Guard uniform, that distinctive swirl of blue, red, and yellow, stood in stark contrast to the sea of morning blacks and purples surrounding him. The morning sun caught the edge of his halberd, sending occasional flashes of light across the somber gathering. Dawn had broken reluctantly over the Vatican that day. A chill hung in the air, unseasonable for late April, though fitting somehow for the occasion. Mist clung to the cobblestones in patches like fragments of night, unwilling to surrender to morning light, as if the world itself was reluctant to begin this day, the day they would bury Pope Francis. By 8 a.m., the square had filled beyond capacity. World leaders sat in reserved sections, solemn-faced in dark suits and formal clothes. Behind them stretched a tapestry of humanity, the faithful with rosaries moving between weathered fingers, tourists with cameras hanging unused around their necks, nuns dabbing at eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Lucas kept his gaze fixed forward, his breathing measured beneath the weight of his breastplate. 14 years of service in the Swiss Guard had perfected his ability to remain motionless for hours, his face betraying nothing of the thoughts that might stir beneath the surface. Even on this day, perhaps especially on this day, his discipline would not falter, or so everyone thought. From somewhere inside the basilica, organ music began, low, mournful notes that seemed to vibrate through the very stones. The crowd stilled. The procession was beginning. First came altar servers with candles and incense, their young faces solemn beneath the weight of tradition. Then priests in white, bishops in purple, cardinals in deep crimson, a river of color and sacred symbolism flowing from the basilica's depths. And finally, the coffin. Simple cypress as Francis had requested. No gold ornamentation, no elaborate carvings, just a wooden box bearing the crucifix carried by 8 pallbearers in black. As it emerged into daylight, Lucas felt something press against his chest, hidden beneath his uniform, a weight known only to him. Lucas Bowman had never been the type of man people noticed, except when they needed to. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a jaw like granite and eyes that gave away nothing. Born to a watchmaker in Lucerne, he had grown up surrounded by precision. His father's work covered with tiny gears and springs that measured life in careful increments had been his first classroom. Everything matters, his father would say, magnifying glass pressed to his eye. The space between seconds is where craftsmanship lives. This philosophy followed Lucas through school, military service, and eventually to Rome. While other recruits struggled with the Swiss Guard's demands for perfection, Lucas absorbed them like a plant turning toward natural light. At 37, his record in the Pontifical Swiss Guard was spotless, a blank canvas of compliance. 14 years without a single citation for tardiness, never a uniform infraction, not one moment of inappropriate levity on duty. Bowman's like a blueprint for the rest of them. His commander once remarked, "If I could clone him, I would." Only his roommate during training knew that Lucas kept a small wooden clock, his father's first creation, beside his bed. And only his roommate knew that sometimes, late at night, Lucas would wind it carefully before kneeling to pray. That morning of the funeral, though, something had shifted. As he stood before the mirror, adjusting his uniform, his hands had trembled slightly. Just once, he'd stared at them as if they belonged to someone else. Then he'd reached into his breast pocket and touched something hidden there, the letter. And in that moment, standing alone in the barracks, Something softened in his eyes, a hairline crack in perfect stone. The Swiss Guard didn't just wear tradition, they embodied it. Every ceremonial step, every precise angle of the halberd, every stoic stare had been refined through centuries of service. For a papal funeral, their duty wasn't simply security, it was symbolism. They were living monuments to unwavering fidelity. That morning, in the Guard's private chambers beneath the Vatican, Commandant Schmid had addressed the funeral detail with unusual solemnity. The gay-haired officer moved slowly between the rows of guards, his voice low but penetrating. "Today you carry 5 centuries on your shoulders," he'd said, adjusting a crooked tassel on a younger guard's uniform. "Perhaps more than any other day in your service, this one demands absolute precision. The eyes of the world will be upon us," Schmid continued. "Not just Catholics, everyone. They will see in your stillness the Church's resilience, in your discipline, her strength, any deviation." He paused here, making brief eye contact with each guard. "Any deviation will dishonor not only the pontiff, but the faith itself." Lucas had stood motionless, his breathing controlled, his face impassive. But behind that mask, his mind had drifted to another conversation, another room, another promise. "Visual perfection," Schmid was saying now, his voice hardening. "If even one guard moves, it will be the only thing the world remembers from this day." A muscle in Lucas's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Schmid stopped directly in front of him, studying him with narrowed eyes. "Something to say, Bowman?" "No, sir." "Perfect, immediate, respectful?" Schmid nodded and moved on, but not before giving Lucas a final, lingering look. The kind veteran officers give when their instincts prickle without clear cause. As the guards filed out toward their positions, an older officer caught Lucas by the elbow just for a moment and leaned in. "Remember who you served today, Bowman," he whispered. "Not just the office, the man." It had started with a child's cry. 5 years earlier, during an ordinary May audience, Lucas had been stationed near the colonnade when he'd heard it. A high, terrified wail cutting through the murmur of the crowd. A small boy, maybe 4 or 5, separated from his parents in the crush of pilgrims. Protocol demanded Lucas stay at his post radio for assistance, maintain visual surveillance. Instead, he'd moved 15 feet from his position and lifted the child above the crowd until a frantic mother pushed through. A minor breach quickly corrected, barely noticed except by the Pope. 2 days later, a Vatican aide had appeared at the guard's barracks with a message. His Holiness requests Lance Corporal Bowman's presence alone. Lucas had followed the aide through the Apostolic Palace's labyrinthine corridors to a modest study where Pope Francis sat, not behind his desk, but in a simple chair by the window. Afternoon light streamed in, catching the dust motes in the air. "Your Holiness," Lucas had said, bowing deeply. "Sit, please," Francis replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his. His voice carried the slight rasp of age, but retained its distinctive warmth. When Lucas hesitated, the Pope smiled. "It's not a suggestion, son. You know why I asked for you?" the Pope inquired, leaning forward slightly. "No, Your Holiness." Francis nodded toward a side table where a small security monitor displayed footage grainy but clear enough of Lucas lifting the crying child. "You left your post?" "Yes, Your Holiness." "I apologize," for Francis raised a weathered hand. "Why did you do it?" Lucas paused, choosing his words carefully. The child was in distress. "So are many who come here?" Francis countered gently. What was different about this one? Lucas shifted slightly, a barely perceptible movement that for him spoke volumes. "He reminded me of someone." The Pope waited, patient as stone. "My brother," Lucas finally said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "When we were young, there was a crowd at a festival in our town. He got separated. I couldn't reach him in time. He didn't elaborate further. Didn't explain the hospital visit afterward, the broken arm, the nightmares that followed. You know what I've noticed about the Swiss Guard?" Francis asked, changing direction. You're trained to be seen but not noticed, to stand so still that people forget you're human. He leaned back in his chair. It's necessary, of course, but dangerous too. Dangerous, your holiness, for the soul. Francis clarified to separate duty from compassion is an artificial division. God doesn't recognize it. The conversation shifted then. Francis asked about Lucas's family, his hometown, told stories of his own youth in Buenos Aires, not as pontiff to guard, but manto man. When I was young, Francis said, I made a mistake. I chose institutional loyalty over human need. It haunted me. He looked out the window. Sometimes, Lucas, the holiest thing we can do is move when we're told to stand still. As their time ended, Francis rose with slight difficulty. There's a tradition in Argentina, he said, where we say goodbyes twice. Once for the body, once for the soul. He placed a hand briefly on Lucas's shoulder. Remember that when the time comes. Lucas had left the study changed in ways he couldn't articulate, like a clock whose internal mechanism had been subtly adjusted. Still functioning, still precise, but keeping slightly different time. 2 nights before the funeral, Lucas had been returning to the barracks after evening patrol when a slight figure emerged from the shadows of St. Anne's Gate. Father Ventresca stooped now with age, his hair bone white, his hands like paper maps of creased rivers. A moment, guard Bauman, the priest said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas stopped. Ventresca had been the Pope's personal secretary for over a decade, a quiet, watchful presence in the papal apartments. It's rather unusual, Ventresca began, glancing around as if concerned about being overheard. But then he was an unusual man. From within his cassack, he withdrew a cream-colored envelope sealed with the paper mark. No address, no formal insignia, just a single line in shaky handwriting on the back for the man who once stood guard in tears. He wrote several letters in his final weeks, Ventresca explained, most to family, to close friends. This one he was quite specific about its delivery. A pause. He said you'd understand the timing. How did he know I would still be here? Lucas asked softly. After all these years? Ventresca's lips curved in a gentle smile. He said, some men stand guard because it's their duty, others because it's their nature. The old priest touched Lucas's arm briefly. He knew which kind you were. Lucas waited until he was alone in his quarters, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed before breaking the seal. The letter inside was handwritten on simple paper. No paper letterhead, no formal declarations, just words in the distinctive, slightly uneven script of an old man writing with an arthritic hand. Lucas, it began without preamble. If you're reading this, I've gone to meet our Father. Strange how we spend our lives preparing for this journey, yet still approach it like bewildered travelers without a map. I've been thinking about our conversation from years ago, about the boy in the crowd, about your brother, about rules and when to break them. Because in you, Lucas, I recognized something rare. A man who stands guard not out of duty to an institution, but out of love for what that institution should represent. Those are the guards we need most, especially when no one is watching. The world will tell you that discipline means remaining still when everything inside you says to move. Sometimes that's true. But the greatest discipline is knowing when movement serves a higher stillness. If one day you find yourself torn between the letter of tradition and its spirit, remember this: I saw you. God sees you. And perhaps that is enough. When the time comes for my final procession, I will not hear your footsteps, but I will feel them. Francisco Lucas read it 3 times, each reading slower than the last. His hand trembled slightly, not with indecision, but with the weight of certainty. He carefully folded the letter and slipped it into the inner pocket of his uniform jacket directly over his heart. The choir began to sing, Jesus, Remember Me, the hymn Francis had chosen years before. Simple plaintive notes rising above the square. Lucas watched the coffin's slow progression down the steps. Behind it walked the papal household, secretaries, attendants, longtime staff, their faces drawn with genuine grief rather than ceremonial solemnity. Among them, Father Ventresca moved slowly, one hand resting on the arm of a younger priest for support. As he passed Lucas's position, the old man's eyes lifted briefly, meeting the guard's gaze for the slightest moment. Something passed between them, unspoken, invisible to cameras and onlookers, but undeniable. Permission, understanding, recognition. The pea-bearers lowered the Pope's coffin onto the bier, positioned at the foot of the basilica steps. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re stepped forward, incense in hand, ready to begin the final commendation. The crowd held its collective breath, prepared for the familiar rhythm of ancient ritual. Lucas's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the hallard's shaft. The moment crystallized around him like ice forming on a still pond, sudden, silent, transformative. In 14 years of service, he had never broken formation, never disrupted ceremony, never placed personal impulse above protocol until now. His first step was precise, not hesitant, but measured. Boot heel on marble, the square falls silent. Step by step, guard Lucas reaches Pope Francis's cypress coffin. With measured grace, he shifts his halberd, draws a sealed letter from his breast pocket, kneels, and places it beneath the crucifix. For your final journey, he whispers. 28 seconds, and the breach is done. Cameras freeze, crowds ripple, yet no one intervenes. The Mass flows on, subtly altered. Cardinal Re swings incense around the letter, as if to say, this, too. Afterward, Lucas waits in a lamplit room. Cardinal Favreau, Commandant Schmid, and Archbishop Tremblay ask why. A letter from His Holiness, Lucas says. Sometimes duty isn't mere protocol. Schmid calls it an oath broken. Lucas answers, the oath's deeper meaning. Favreau reads a copied line. If one man can carry love into tradition, let him do so bravely. Silence. No charges, no statement. Reassignment instead. 3 days later, a quiet envelope. Transfer to the Apostolic Archives. No braid, no halberd, just black uniform, pencil rules, and miles of history. Supervisor Monsignor Deza is dust dry but fair. Some men guard history better than ceremony, he says. Weeks pass. In the stillness, Lucas's duty deepens. Crossing the gardens, a schoolboy recognizes him. Were you scared? It was forbidden, Lucas replies. Rules protect something precious, but no rule outranks the good it serves. Did the Pope really write? The boy asks. Lucas smiles. Some things stay between friends. The conclave churns above. In the stacks, time moves by centuries. Lucas walks on, straight-backed, precise, yet inwardly changed. A clock keeping perfect rhythm but telling truer time. Not a guard who shattered tradition, but one who honored its purpose. Was he right to move? Does loyalty sometimes require bending the rules we swear to uphold? Share your thoughts. Join us for more stories of duty, mercy, and courage.